Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist depression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Gary and Gindanami, or as we would say here in Kurdistan, where I currently am, Baharabeh. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ. It is your local community radio station. My name's Andy and I will be with you for the next hour, coming to you, as I said, from Bashur, the Kurdish region of Iraq, but broadcasting on Yagur and Turrbal country there in Magunjin, Brisbane. And today on the show, we're going to be talking about history. We are going to be talking to Tim and Christian, who make a podcast called The People's History of Australia. And I guess in the course of this conversation, we'll elaborate a bit more about why I also often make shows about history on the Paradigm Shift, because it has the shared purposes of illuminating our understanding about who we are and how we got to be where we are today as a society and as individuals, but also it can teach us some lessons for the future going forward, either to not repeat the mistakes of the past or to learn from some of the successes. And of course, we should all be grateful for those who have gone before us and all the things that they have done to give us the world we have today, as so much work went into it in lots of different ways. And part of that was social movements in this country that made it into a place where we have, comparative to most of the world, amazing workers' rights and social security and a fairly egalitarian society. And it didn't just happen by accident, and it certainly wasn't done from the generosity of those in power. It was people working together to get a better outcome for all. And that is a bit of what Tim and Christian cover in The People's History of Australia. It's a little bit of unearthing some stories that don't get told in the normal history books as well. And I haven't listened to too many of the episodes, but it's looking down the list, it's such a great cross-section of the way that people have got together to make history. You know, even if at the time they didn't think that they were the important people, the ones who get written about, they were shaping the world and shaping the future. So that's what's coming up. Of course, you can listen to their podcast. You'll find out details of how to do it, but most of us these days can figure out how to search for a podcast. And maybe after hearing my conversation with them, you'll want to. Let's get into it.
Hey, I'm Christian. I'm one of the hosts of the People's History of Australia podcast, and we're a podcast about radical Australian history, workers, and social and protest movements. Other than that, I also work as a librarian in public libraries, and in my previous job, I was also a elected union rep. And generally, I like to throw myself into organising and campaigns and all that sort of thing. And making a podcast seems like a nice complement to that.
Yeah, I'm Tim. I also work with Christian on the podcast People's History of Australia. I'm a semi-professional historian as well. I did a PhD on student protest from 1985 to 2006 in Australia, which used a lot of oral history. I think I did 72 interviews or something ridiculous like that. Also, I'm a I guess, have been involved in left-wing and anarchist politics for a long time. Got involved with a collective called Mutiny in the mid-2000s and kind of helped put out an anarchist zine called Mutiny for a long time. And yeah, kind of the podcast was like a culmination of my interest in history.
Yes, the People's History of Australia podcast is what we're going to be talking about today. Can you start off by saying what inspired the podcast? And I guess the other question is, in terms of radical politics, why is it worthwhile talking about what's happened in the past when there's so many current issues to focus on?
I think that's a great question, and kind of reminded me of this funny encounter I had when I was a uni student ages ago, and I was hitchhiking and I got picked up by this truckie, and he was asking me what I did and all that kind of thing. And I told him I was a uni student studying history, and he kind of replied in this slightly resentful voice, "Oh, that's what my tax dollars are paying for, is it? Yeah, well, what use is that?" But yeah, it kind of gets to a really valuable and important question, which is, what is the point of looking at history, and particularly radical history, and particularly when we're living in such hectic times where, maybe you could argue that we should just be overwhelmingly focused on the present and not just navel gazing and looking in archives. I guess I would say this, that the past that we cover in our podcast, it doesn't really feel like the past to me, because in some ways it still feels like it's happening. Like, the people we look at in our podcast are people who lived under capitalism like we do now in Australia, like we do now. They, like us, spent a huge portion of their waking lives going to work for somebody else in a job that was probably pretty alienating, and where they got bossed around all day and took orders, didn't have much control over what they did, could be fired pretty arbitrarily. If they got fired, they were going to struggle to pay the rent. Just had to worry about whether they could afford housing, whether they could provide for themselves, whether the environment was going to be livable, whether their children would have a life on an earth that was going to be worth inhabiting. And I feel more and more like, when I look at these problems that other people have faced in the past, it doesn't seem all that different to what we're looking at now. I think that if we can discover that people just like us in the past have got together and done something about those problems, well, yeah, that's pretty morally encouraging. But even more than that, I think if we can find that people just like us got together, done something about these problems and have won, that shows you what's possible and what we can do in the present faced with similar problems. And I think there's a lot that can be learned from that, people have fought racism, have fought their bosses in their workplace in the past, have fought homophobia and sexism, and have won victories. Then, that tells us that we can do the same today, and at what works and what doesn't work, and how we can succeed in the future. And certainly, as somebody who's been a union rep in my workplace, been on strike, all that kind of thing, I don't think I would have been half as good at organising any of that if I didn't have some sense of what had gone before me and what had succeeded. So if we want to overcome and struggle with the problems that we face right now, we need to know what's happened before.
I think also, one important thing for me was that the history we're talking about is a way of kind of stealing activists, in the present, to kind of deal with the inevitable drop-offs in activity. I think there are always, high points of activism, and maybe it's easier to get involved then, but there are real drop-offs. So I do think having stories from the past can kind of, consolidate activist politics and, steal them for the long struggle, the long, hard, arduous task of trying to confront capitalism and the ruling class. I think, the lessons thing, that was certainly something we wanted to draw out. Not in a, simplistic way that, the tactic that was used in a particular campaign in, I don't know, the early 20th century or in the 60s and 70s is going to work exactly, today. It can having a sense of history can expand the repertoire of tactics and strategies that we have. Also, I think there's a real cultural cringe about Australian history. I think, to borrow a term that Ian McIntyre has used, there is a sense that Australia is this, really boring place that nothing's ever happened. But when you look at our podcast and when you read, radical history, that completely changes your understanding of what Australia is and what it's been like in the past, and I think what it's like in the present as well.
And the term people's history is one we hear a bit. Of course, many of us would think of Howard Zinn, but it does seem to be cropping up more and more. So I'm interested in what does this term people's history mean for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andy. Maybe the first use of it was from A.L. Morton in the 1930s, who was a Marxist historian who wrote a People's History of England. And then, of course, Howard Zinn, popularises it with a People's History of the United States. I think, one important thing, when you're doing People's History, it's about, ordinary people taking action. It's not just a static description of ordinary people. It's not a study of, the cultural habits of miners in Newcastle. It has a sense that, people are active, they're struggling, they're in motion. That sense of struggle, that sense of being part of something. So that's really something we wanted to convey in the podcast. I think for us, we wanted the people's history that we were doing to be emphatically intersectional, to really cover, the nexus of class, race, and gender, and, the host of oppressions that we face.
It did remind me of this quote about this book I quite like called Bread and Roses, which is a sort of personal history of a couple of communist female activists in the early 20th century in Australia. And the blurb for the book, it says, "When someone told Mary Wright that she was part of history, she was amused because it made her think of old books, lists of dates, and the kings and queens of England." And yeah, that seemed so apt to me because it's true. When people think of history, they just think of stuff that is just utterly boring and so remote from our lives. So much of what we read in the history books, the kind of history that we get taught at school, what we see in the newspapers and on the news about what is important in society and who is making the decisions and where power lies and who's important. All of it just utterly excludes the majority of the population, the working class, understood in the broadest sense. And yeah, also it's just boring. And I guess we want to show that history is also that of, regular, ordinary working class people pulling off extraordinary things and fighting and changing the world and changing themselves and making society better. And that we in our vast multitudes are the most powerful force on earth, effectively. In my mind, that's the real history. That's the only history really that's interesting and exciting. And I don't think in an Australian context it just gets out there enough. So we want to do our little bit to amplify and propagandise for this kind of history.
History can be fraught, and we have seen and continue to see these kind of culture wars about the way that history is told. So I'm interested in how you navigate the kind of moral challenges that arise when telling these stories of the past. And I guess in Australia, the classic example is that there was this amazing solidarity between Australian workers that achieved so much, but at the same time, they were very racist and very keen on the White Australia policy. So I guess how do you navigate those challenges in the way that we approach history?
So I think that's a good question. I think maybe with the podcast you could critique us that we have maybe evaded that issue by focusing on more like directly inspiring stories of collective action and struggle. But like for me, the takeaway would be that you have to acknowledge the reality of this, like racism and sexism and the way that's divided the working class and ordinary people, but also not reducing everyday workers to this like one-sided racist stereotype that you know the labour movement was irredeemably racist without any deviation from that. Like I think you get the sense in a lot of more mainstream Australian histories that, you know, racism was more the fault of the labour movement than the ruling class, which I think is an argument that needs to be challenged. And so we have looked at like some stories that counter that image of the labour movement, like particularly the episode on the industrial workers of the world, which really emphatically challenged racism and like, across the world was a multi-ethnic organisation rather than just like an Anglo working class one. So, and then I think particularly the most recent episode on radical Chinese labour, you know, really like challenges a conception that we have of passive and pliant Chinese labour and merely being, you know, a tool of the ruling class in lowering wages across the board. So yeah, that's my brief answer to that question.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question because we can't shy away from racism and sexism and homophobia, and also the fact that like most workers, by dint of living in capitalist society, which is profoundly oppressive and racist and homophobic and sexist, you know, have held these views to one degree or another. And it's certain that, you know, working people that we cover in our podcast have held these views and, you know, have probably said and done all kinds of nasty and oppressive things. I think what we really want to draw out is exactly as Tim said, to show that these ideas can be challenged, and they can be challenged in the course of struggle, and that working class struggle, understood in the broadest sense possible, opens up the possibility of overcoming those oppressions in struggle and of making an argument and winning an argument for why they're not in our interests. So I'll give you a more concrete example of that, right? Our first episode is about a strike by 300 mostly Eastern and Southern European and Middle Eastern migrants in a textile factory, Cortex, in East Brunswick in Melbourne in 1981. The workers in that workforce were from Turkey, they were from Greece, they were Serbian, Croatian, people from various Arabic-speaking countries, and all of these kind of groups have a pretty intense and long-standing, mutually antagonistic relationship in many ways. You know, there's a lot of bad blood going between, in many ways, people from these countries going back many hundreds of years, and that can definitely like lead to mutual antagonism and hostility. But the fact was, all the workers in this factory, no matter what their identities or where they came from, were getting treated appallingly, you know, ripped off and treated in a racist way, and were suffering under just the most atrocious working conditions. And they couldn't overcome those conditions as individuals. The only way they could do it was by joining together with their fellow workers and going on strike and fighting the boss. And that's what they did. And to do that, they have to overcome the racism and the other oppressions that divide them. And, you know, in the course of that struggle, we saw people like learning each other's language, sharing different foods from across their cultures on the picket line, like standing shoulder to shoulder, arm to fight the goons and cops that the company sent to break their picket line, translating things into each other's language and interpreting for each other, and like struggling together. And I'm not saying that everybody became a perfect anti-racist after that struggle, by no means, but I think that working class struggle against the ruling class, it requires us to fight against sexism, racism, homophobia, and it provides the basis for doing so, because the only way we can win is by struggling against those particular oppressions. And likewise, in the course of this struggle at Cortex, it was an overwhelmingly female workforce. And to win that strike, they had to be active out every day on the picket line. And so they had to overcome all kinds of oppressions that are attendant upon, growing up as females in Australia and elsewhere. You're taught from a young age to be like a people pleaser, to be quiet and submissive and subservient and not assert yourself or be loud and boisterous and aggressive and strong. And again, to win that strike, you have to overcome sexism. And the women in that strike had to get their male partners or relatives in their households to take on the overwhelming burden of like domestic work, food, childcare during that strike to win that strike. And so again, there's this pressing, urgent need. Not you should be anti-racist or anti-sexist, because if you're not, you're like a bad person and you should feel bad. But because you have to do it to win, and it's the only way. And yeah, so I think that kind of struggle opens up the possibility of overcoming oppression. And so we want to look at those moments when people have shown it's possible. We're not pretending like racism, sexism, homophobia, discrimination doesn't exist, but we also don't want to pretend like it's eternal and immutable and like can't be taken on. We want to show that it can be. And an episode that I really love recently is about the overwhelmingly white Communist Party of Australia really taking on racism in a path-breaking and leading way in the 1930s in Australia, and coming out really strongly against the White Australia policy and against the racist treatment of Aboriginal people. And so you saw, like, when Australia was even more deeply racist country than it is today, like thousands of white workers attending rallies and coming to workplace mass meetings and unequivocally condemning the massacres and the frontier violence and the genocide against Aboriginal people in the 1930s. Like, it was so ahead of its time. And they explicitly said the reason that they're doing this is because the ruling class, the bosses that we're fighting against, the same people that are, exploiting us, are the same people that are conducting a genocide against Aboriginal people. Our enemy's the same, and our struggle has to be the same. So yeah, we think that it is possible to fight oppression, and we want to show and highlight those moments when people have done that.
Yeah, and like two other episodes that I think were particularly strong on that point would be the Ford Broadmeadows strikes in 1973, which was again a multi-ethnic workplace that had to overcome an array of issues of like how to communicate in different languages, but through a collective process, people were able to overcome those divisions, and that story culminates in a very epic riot, which our listeners probably enjoyed a lot. And the Jobs for Women episode about women in Wollongong in the 1980s taking on BHP, the biggest company in Australia at that time, winning jobs in the steelworks of Wollongong, and were able to win men to their side, rather than just dismissing men as irredeemably sexist, but were able to work together in a collective way. Yeah, so I think those examples are worth remembering as well.
So, in the course of making this podcast, can you tell us about, are there any favourite episodes that you've done?
That's a really, really hard one because there are so many episodes that are really close to my heart. But I think in terms of a lot of the things we've been talking about in this interview, probably one of my favourites, and certainly one of the ones that has drawn the most emphatic and amazed feedback from listeners, has been our recent one about convict resistance and rebellion in Australia. So, in brief, not to spoil the episode, but basically when Australia was invaded by the British Empire in 1788, the employers, the ruling class, they could set up all the workplaces that they liked. They could establish all the factories, farms and whatever. But unless they've got people to, exploit and work for them, they're not going to get very far. And the only way to do that in 1788 was to bring people here as convicts, like as kind of semi-slaves, and have them as the working class and the workforce. And it turned out that workforce, to many people's surprise, actually staged massive resistance and massive uprisings against their masters. Like from the year 1788 onwards, the convicts were in a state of almost constant rebellion, individual acts of defiance and mass collective revolts. Yeah, they struggled against the most appalling odds and the most brutal punishment and treatment. And yeah, they still did so on a massive scale. And I think we owe a lot to these people. But I think also that shows that when the invasion started, the colony wasn't some unified body of invaders or colonists in lockstep with each other as a monolithic bloc. All, supporting the British Empire and enthusiastically waging genocide. Turned out that, the same big business interests, it's the same pastoralists and governments that were conducting, massacres and genocide on one side of the frontier. On the other side of the frontier, they were ruthlessly exploiting convicts, and the convicts, just like First Nations people in this country, they were fighting back on the other side of the frontier against the bosses as well. And yeah, I think that really disrupts a lot of ideas people have about colonial society. And I think it's a really crying shame in many ways that the resistance against the forming Australian capitalism, that resistance was divided and weakened by racism, and convicts could never, in resistance to the colonial masters, could never unite with Aboriginal people, and wage a struggle to bring down Australian capitalism. That episode I found really exciting and inspiring.
One of my favourite stories from the podcast was that of John Joseph, an African-American man who was one of the people who was tried because of the Eureka Stockade, and he was the very first person that the prosecutors put up. And basically the idea of the prosecution was to take this racially vilifiable subject and get a conviction, and then that would set the stage for convicting everyone else. They would pick an easy target and go for it. This is the 19th century, well before anti-racist politics had been developed more thoroughly, but John Joseph was immediately acquitted by the jury, and then reportedly was, carried out by a crowd of thousands outside the court. And I think that's an incredible story that shows that, racism isn't immutable and can be challenged. That even in these seemingly distant past, that you can still, fight racism and win, and that their class solidarity can trump, racial divisions. For my favourite episodes, I think some of them are ones where there's funny stories behind the making or origins of them. For me, the episode with Diana on the Jobs for Women campaign in Wollongong in the 80s was really cool. So She lives in the Blue Mountains, and I went up there from Sydney, and I'd asked her to prepare like a few notes for the podcast episode, and I expected page of notes at best. But she actually prepared over 20 pages of highly detailed answers to all my questions in an incredibly thoughtful and meticulous way. And then we sat down and we did the interview, and it was amazing. So that was really cool that people get excited by the thought of being on our podcast. I think this is also maybe an opportunity to plug some of our upcoming episodes, and so I think we've got about 13 episodes in the backlog, which is a bit ridiculous, but so there's one that I did with a guy called Ken Mansell, who lives in Daylesford in rural Victoria, and he's a veteran of Monash activism from the 1960s and an incredibly thorough and committed historian who does the most meticulous primary source research imaginable. And so I sat down with Ken and kind of talked about his writing and his experiences, and the conversation went for about 3 hours, pretty much without a pause. And he physically recreated the act of throwing rocks at the US consulate in Melbourne in July 1968. Where there was a near riot, maybe an actual riot even, against the US consulate, against the Vietnam War, as a kind of symbol of imperialism. So I'm not sure what we're going to do for the editing of that episode, but it was really cool and something to really look forward to. There's also a bunch of episodes on the anti-uranium mining movement coming out. So Sandra Bloodworth, who we talked to for the Cortex strike, was also heavily involved in the movement against uranium mining in the 70s, and hopefully that will be part of a 2-part series of kind of the struggle against uranium mining, with the second part being on the Jabiluka campaign in 98. And I think that would be probably our first example of really environmentalist protest, but it's also about the links between union and working class organising and environmentalism.
Something to look forward to. And so if people are interested in listening to the podcast, how can they do that?
Yeah, great question. That's pretty easily done. If you grab any podcast app on your phone and do a search for People's History of Australia, it'll probably come up. You can also bring you to our website, which is www.peopleshistory.com.au. We've also got a Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky and TikTok account, which you can follow as well. And you get a lot of non-podcast content on there, we do lots of on this day, such and such happened, little stories, and those are quite popular as well.
In Sydney, we're doing the Radical Sydney Conference, and we're also going to do a series of in-person walking tours around suburbs of Sydney and the stories of their radical pasts.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Christian and Tim.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you, Andy.
Our guests on the show today, a People's History of Australia podcast. Find it on your apps or at peopleshistory.com.au, where you can have a look at all the different episodes they've got, and a lot of fantastic stories there is. And of course, there's so much to learn from the past, but even beyond that, they're just good stories, and I think we're just flooded with kind of mediocre stories in our culture of commercial media constantly cranking out movies and books and TV shows that tell us really nothing about who we are or who we can be or what are the things that really matter in this life. And yet there's such a richness all around us in people who have lived out extraordinary lives and who in some ways have undertook that search for meaning and created something without the budget of, the storytellers in our culture. And so I think very much in support of things like a People's History of Australia that try to find the really valuable stories that are all around us, hiding just out of sight, but so often obscured by the big flashy advertising and things like that. If you happen to be listening to this in Sydney, in March, the People's History crew are holding a Radical Sydney conference where they will get people together away from our screens, all in the one place, able to meet each other and hear some of these stories as well, which I think that's a worthwhile idea as well. I'll see you next week.